afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us at BDO for this National Minimum Wage Consultation session. We are delighted to have a panel today, which includes 4 commissioners from the Low Pay Commission. The Low Pay Commission is an independent body which advises the government on the national living wage and the national minimum wage. I'm going to introduce you now to the 4 members we have today. So I'll start with Baroness Philippa Stroud. She is chair of the LPC and is a British think tanker and co-founder of the forum. She's a member of the House of Lords, CEO of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, and chair of the Social Metrics Commission. We're also joined by Andrew Goodacre, who is the CEO of BIRA, which is the British Independent Retail Association, and he represents BIRA on the Department of Business Retail Sector Council and serves as a member of the British Retail Consortium's Policy Board and the Welsh Retail Council. Matthew Fell also joins us. Matthew is Director of Competitiveness at Business LDN. He's responsible for a programme of work on competitiveness, including regulatory, fiscal and economic measures that support growth and make London a compelling destination for investment. Finally, Dr. Patricia Rice is a Senior Research Fellow at St Anne's College and the Department of Economics at Oxford University. Patricia's primary research field is labour economics, and her work has examined the transition of young people from full-time schooling to the labour market. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oops, we think we've missed one. Natalie, if you could go back one slide, please. Thank you. We're also delighted to be joined today by Jamie Carter, and Jamie is Senior Policy Manager for Employment at Make UK. Make UK is the organisation which represents more than 20,000 manufacturing and engineering businesses across the UK. Jamie leads Make UK's work with industry and government on all areas of labour market policy and regulation, including pay, immigration and employment law reform. I'm also here. I'm Caroline Harwood. I'm the National Head of Employment Tax at BDO in the UK, and I'm joined by my National Minimum Wage Specialist colleagues, Delo Reggio and Siobhan Waters. So without further ado, we're going to move on to a little bit of information, some background. So under the new Labour government, the LPC have been given a new remit, and that's to include the cost of living for the first time as a factor when setting the rates for national minimum wage. They're going to consider the 18 to 20-year-old age rate as the government moves towards introducing a single adult rate going forwards. Today, we're really going to welcome your thoughts and views and have some specific questions we'll be asking throughout the session using a polling function. And I really do urge you to complete the polls. They are completely anonymous. So when you answer the questions, it won't be associated to your organisation or yourself, but it will give us some really useful information which will spark discussion around those statistics. Please make use of the Q&A box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, to ask any additional questions, make any points that you'd like to raise, and we'll be covering those at the end. Following the session, we will share a recording and we'll also share a copy of the slides. So you'll have everybody's contact details through those slides should you wish to make any contact with individuals after the session. So let's move on to a warm-up polling question. Natalie, next slide, please. So what impact does the annual national minimum wage rate increase have on your business or your organisation? So if you could click on one of the answers, is the impact significant, fairly significant, minimal, or none? Unfortunately, the host and the panelists cannot vote, so this is a participants only response to this question. We'll just wait for a moment, get the answers in. Natalie, do we have our answers yet? So almost half of you find that the annual increase in national minimum wage rate has a significant impact on your business or organisation. And more than a quarter say it's significant, and only a quarter of participants feel that it's minimal or none. So I suspect that's the driver behind the excellent levels of attendance we have today. If you press close at the bottom of your polling box there with the results that you'll see on your screen, you'll go back to the main pages. And I'm going to hand this over now to our panelists to talk to us about how you think this significant impact is going to look going forwards.
Caroline, thank you so much for that. Just to reiterate, my name is Philippa Stroud and I'm the chair of the Low Pay Commission. And we have Matthew, Andrew and Patricia who are going to be responding to your questions as well this afternoon. We have been going out and listening to businesses around the UK and to hear how the national minimum and the national living wage has been impacting on businesses. And certainly we have heard that it is having a significant impact. And that's a significant impact in two ways. One is on employee experience. And so employees are telling us of the value of the national living wage and how important it is to them. And then employers telling us just how significant it is for them and how significant the two historic increases over the last 2 years have been to their businesses, and how therefore employers are waiting and watching carefully for what happens next. I'd like to invite Matthew just to pick it up from an employer's perspective, and Andrew maybe from an employee perspective.
Great. Well, look, Philippa, thanks, and also thanks to everyone for taking part and putting the results in. Just a few reflections from me, really. One is I'm probably not too surprised by just how many people feel this is significant, given that if you take the last 2 years together, we've seen something in the order of a 20% uplift. So that's not surprising. It's beginning to bite quite significantly on firms. I think in terms of a forward look, some of the things that we'll be paying particular attention to are really, one is the overall cost base facing business, because I think we're aware that it's not just the national living wage, national minimum wage, but also the associated employment costs for quite a lot of the other sectors that we're involved with, issues around business rates, energy costs, and so on. So I think firstly, we look at the sort of overall quantum of cost pressures facing business. Secondly, I think then we're also looking very carefully at the employment effects and also what it does in terms of firms' ability to hire people. We know over the last couple of years we've faced a very tight labour market, and we've been looking at how much of that been a driver of wages going up in certain sectors, as opposed to what we're doing with the national minimum wage. And then for me, look, I think the third factor is looking at firms' ability to invest, because we're very attentive to productivity, levels of capital investment, and so on. And we know it's a different story for some sectors and some firms compared to others in terms of their ability to automate, their ability to invest, and so on, and how that goes hand in hand with staffing levels and affordability of the national minimum wage. So I hope that just begins to give you a little bit of a flavour of just some of the issues that are very much on our mind as we weigh up where the rate should actually be.
Thanks, Matthew. Andrew, did you want to comment as well?
Yeah, thanks, Philippa. So it's my first year as a commissioner, and it's been fascinating listening to employees. And as Philippa said, we've been actively listening now for 6 months probably, and we'll continue to do so until we make our final recommendation. We've spoken to employees, old and young, and across many, many sectors. And what we really, the things that stand out for me are as Philippa said, national living wage is so important to these people. It is for many their main income, and it's not always apparent that they're actually seeing a real benefit from the increases they've seen. If you to ask young people, do they feel better off? They would arguably say no. And that's not because people aren't paying the national living wage. It's because other cost increases are impacting on their perception of being better off or feeling better off. And that's something that we're cognizant of. Another aspect that has come up, especially for the younger people, are the age discrimination levels, the pay discrimination levels that we have, especially the 18 to 20-year-olds now. And pleasingly, for many sectors, we've heard from employers who don't do that anymore. They pay based on the job that people are doing. But where they do exist, it really, I guess, causes a deep sense of frustration for younger workers who are doing the same job as an older colleague. There may only be 2 years age difference between them, if that. The younger person may even be more experienced, having been there longer, but there's still a significant pay gap between them. And that does frustrate young people, as you can imagine, more so. Well aware, however, that in some industries, these separate pay levels have been crucial in the past in controlling the overall labour bill. So again, we're aware of the perceived conflict in that. But the feedback we're getting from younger people, and pleasingly from some sectors, is that the pay differentials aren't as obvious or used as much as one might have imagined. And I think that's it, really. You know, employers do value it. Employees really do value national living wage. And you know, we are all ears today to hear your views and perspectives on this.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask Patricia to comment too, just because she is an independent commissioner, so always has some incredibly valuable views on this. But just to say, while I give her a second to think about it, I didn't give her a heads up, that we're acutely aware too that as the national living wage increases, one of the pieces of feedback that we're getting from employers about the significance of this is the way it's eroding the differentials. So we would love to hear your comments in that particular space as well. Patricia, did you want to comment?
Yes, maybe just to pick up the last point you made, Philippa, because as an economist, we've been looking very intently on where the effects of increasing the national minimum wage have come, and we don't see them in employment. Over the many years that the national minimum wage has been in place, we've never been able to find really significant negative impacts on employment from increasing the wage, which makes you ask the question, well, what are employers doing to respond to the increase in national minimum wage? And the one we are really beginning to see, and the one we're quite interested to hear from employers about, is the impact not just on those who are on the national minimum wage, but those who are just above the national minimum wage. And we're beginning to hear a lot about reducing differentials between different grades of workers, in some cases taking out whole grades of workers within the job structure. And so it'd be very interesting to hear from people on the line about how they've responded to increases in the national minimum wage over time.
Thank you, Patricia. Now, is there anybody in the audience who would like to make a point about the differentials between grades being eroded? If you want to put something in the Q&A, then I'll be able to put that to the panel. While people are thinking about that, I'm going to turn to Jamie Carter and ask Jamie, would you like to say how you think that's impacting from the perspective of Make UK?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline, and hi, everyone. Yeah, fully agree with the comments that commissioners have made. I suppose, again, to pick up on that last point that Philippa and Patricia were making about differentials, that very much comes across in our own data, and something we shared with the Commission in our evidence submission was when we surveyed members on what actions they've taken due to the increases in the national living wage in 2024, 33% said they'd increased pay for workers at the national living wage level, and 31% said they had increased pay for the wider workforce in order to maintain pay differentials. So there is almost, those numbers are almost level in terms of pay increases for people who are at that kind of legal minimum level, and those receiving pay increases who, you know, are maybe 1 or 2 levels above that. aside from that, it's often kind of focusing on productivity improvements. That might be investment in technology, automating certain tasks or job roles. Some may have increased prices, but generally, as others have said, the impact doesn't tend to be on employment. It tends to be on other areas of the business. Thank you,
Jamie. That's very interesting. We're getting a number of points coming up now in the Q&A section. So I'm going to bring up some of these points and put it to the panel. Philippa, if you would like to allocate these to the most appropriate people, that would be great. So the first comment is that one organisation is experiencing a lot of frustration coming from the grades slightly above national minimum wage, as has already just been mentioned. And the organisation is under pressure to reflect the same uplift for those grades, and there's been an impact on retention as a result. So is there a point to consider there?
I'm going to just briefly answer that and then throw it over to Matthew, if that's okay on this one. That is a theme that we are hearing over and over again. This erosion of the pay differentials and the pressure now coming for either the same increase, which is just not possible in companies right up the organisation, or for some kind of recognition at that next level up. And as I think Patricia said, we've seen in some organisations just a complete removal of a layer as well. So I think this is something that companies are really considering. Matthew, did you want to pick up on that in more detail?
Well, essentially, Philippa, I think just to endorse what you just said, I mean, I think firstly, we're aware companies essentially have an overall sort of pot or quantum that they're able to put towards pay increases in any year. And the way that most have responded to significant increases in recent years is by squeezing those differentials. I would say that I think when the cost of living crisis was most acute, I think quite a number of firms actually over-indexed or prioritised uplifts at the lower end of their pay scales. And for a short period of time, I think actually that was well received within firms because people felt and recognised that that money was being directed at the people who needed it most. But I think we always knew that that was likely to be a short-term response and that wouldn't wash for a sustained period of time. And I think we're now seeing that playing out. So look, I think the message back to everyone who's tuned in today would be the more granular insights and the more examples that you can give us of where those differentials are starting to be eroded, where those pain points are, that's actually really helpful as we're sort of trying to thread the eye of a needle in terms of determining where the increases should be in the future, at what pace, and where we go with them, and so on. So look, just the feedback and those evidence examples are just really helpful to us.
Yeah, and Caroline, just before we move on to the next question, can I just say one of the things that we have been asked to consider is the impact of the cost of living, and also the terminology around what a genuine living wage would be. And if your listeners today have feedback for us on whether or not they think that the national living wage already takes into account these things, or whether there's more that should be done, all of that is helpful information for us.
Absolutely.
If I may also add, Philippa and Matthew, on top of what they've said, one of the observations I noticed, I mean, part of our remit is to follow or maintain the 2/3 median of average salaries. So we obviously monitor and track where average salary increases are going across the UK. And I'd be interested to know, I guess, from the companies present today, if they're in a position or have they started thinking about where they are in terms of what next year's or their own next financial year's pay increases look like for non-living wage people. This next level up, the supervisors, the level of management that's been referenced in the Q&A, because obviously we try to predict, we're trying to get a sense of what the general line of travel is for overall wage increases in the UK.
Absolutely. As you say, a number of the points being raised in the Q&A, Andrew, are addressing exactly that. So we've had one individual who's saying that they couldn't have a differential between the rates, put the rate up across the board. Someone else has said employees no longer want to progress with more senior levels because the additional wage isn't worth the responsibility. Someone else has said not so much grades, but have had to increase retail staff and retail managers with a big impact. Couldn't increase central teams' wages and they're now leaving. Someone else is saying differentials are becoming a major issue all the way up the pay scale and not just at the levels immediately above national living wage, which is exactly what, to your points. And people are seeking to reduce weekly working hours to recover national living wage increases. Again, agreement on the issue on differentials, a ripple effect. So we're seeing quite a lot of confirmations with the points that you've raised. So one person's given us some statistics, which is quite useful. So an increase in dissatisfaction with colleagues' pay in a recent People survey, as people are unhappy to be paid the same or as close to new starters. 3 years ago, only 1.4% of our colleagues were on national minimum rate. Now 17.4% are on the lowest rate of pay, paying just above adult national living wage, no differential by age, and unable to match the NLW increase for all colleagues. So again, eroding the differential. I think at this point, this actually leads in quite nicely to our next polling question. So if we can move on to that, please, Natalie. So the next question is, does your business use age-related rates? I think we've got the wrong poll there. Natalie, can we go back one polling question? So the question should be, that's it, thank you very much. Does your business use age-related pay? So yes, we pay at the NLW, NMW age rates. Yes, we pay different rates for different ages, but above NLW, NMW rates. No, we pay the higher rate regardless of age. No, we pay above the rates. So we give a couple of moments to answer that polling question. Okay, so a broad range of responses there, which gives us an interesting perspective. Thank you, Natalie. So can we have some questions now from the LPC regarding thoughts or plans on budgeting for upcoming rises, as well as consideration for those not paid at the current rates and how increases are considered across the whole workforce?
Caroline, do you want us to outline some of our questions here?
Yes,
or,
yes, please, that would be great.
I'm going to come to Patricia here just to frame this one, but just before she does, just to say that that span of responses was actually very typical of what we hear when we're taking evidence. And it's rarely more than about 20% who are actually telling us that they use the lower age rates, which is something we found really, really interesting. But Patricia, do you want to come in on this one?
Yes, thank you, Philippa. I think what we observe is quite strong differences across sectors in whether they use age-related pay rates, leaving aside for the moment whether those are the national minimum wage rates or otherwise, just whether rates of pay vary by sector. Certainly a lot of sectors which have high numbers of, which have a high proportion of low-paid workers, people are doing essentially the same tasks irrespective of the age. And under those circumstances, we get very strong feedback that it's felt unfair to discriminate between workers on the basis of age. Other sectors that we deal with, there is a quite clear, strong work experience element. And so in a sense, age is being used as a proxy for work experience. And certainly I think for the Low Pay Commission, when we think about age-related rates, it's a question of disentangling rates of pay that are related to age and rates of pay that actually vary with the experience and the skills of the worker. And so going forward, I think that's going to be a big question in our mind when we're thinking about what happens to existing age-related rates, is how that interacts with the whole question of training. And of course, that then brings us into another area, which is our responsibility, which is a minimum wage rate for apprentices, which may or may not be an issue for many people on the line. So it's really this question of how do you disentangle a rate of pay that varies with age, with one that depends on training and one that depends on experience. So I don't know if any of my colleagues on the Low Pay Commission would like to add to that. Matthew?
Well, Patricia, I think you've really nailed it, but just maybe to just add a little bit of colour that helps the people, just to illustrate what you just said. Two of those sectors, Patricia, that you mentioned, I think that most spring to mind for me personally are, one, if you think about the hairdressing sector, and secondly, hospitality and leisure. And the examples given to us in the hairdressing sector are where it takes people a number of years to essentially build up a client portfolio as their skills develop and their training develops on the job. And that then translates into their ability to generate income and so on. And then secondly, in the leisure and hospitality sectors, where there is a difference actually at the lowest age rates, those below 18, and for example, in licensed settings, their ability to serve alcohol and so on. So there's a material difference in terms of the roles that they can perform or not, for example. Patricia, I hope they just give a little bit more colour to what I think you've exactly put your finger on, which is quite a significant sector spread and variance in terms of approach here.
And just to add to that too, on the apprenticeship rate, we've taken a lot of evidence from companies who have said to us that they don't really use the apprenticeship rate because they view it as being too low, actually, and that it doesn't help them in developing their apprenticeship. So that's just an interesting thing that we are watching at the moment as well. I don't know whether, Andrew, you want to comment a bit more on that.
Yes, I think a common theme across all sectors from employers has been the inability to make good use of apprenticeship levies that are paid in, and seemingly the apprenticeship structure we have at the moment isn't really supporting employers, employees, and so isn't working for anyone. And that seems to be a common theme coming through an awful lot. The rate for apprenticeships is not attractive either, and so the danger is obviously we end up with a skills issue here in some sectors, and a lack of skills, a lack of people learning new skills and technical skills especially. So we're very keen to hear from sectors who have struggled to recruit skilled jobs and struggling with the apprenticeship schemes as they're set up at the moment.
Jamie, do you have anything to add on age differentials, skills differentials, and the apprenticeship levy?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very much reflected in what we see across the manufacturing sector, which is that typically employers will pay according to skill level, job role, productivity, value added, rather than just looking at somebody's age. What I would say about both the sort of different age rates and the apprentice rate is that I think employers find it useful to have a sort of baseline there. And it helps in sort of understanding, I think, how they see different levels of productivity and the contribution that people make. So when I think about the evolution of the national living wage since it was introduced, when it first came in, it applied to employees over the age of 25. Since reduced first to 23, then 21, and now over time to 18. I think at each point that it's been reduced, most of our member companies have felt very comfortable with that. So going from 25 to 23, and then 23 to 21. Where we have started to have some reservations is this proposal now to drop the threshold for the national living wage from 21 down to 18, because I think employers do feel there is more likely to be a gap in terms of productivity, skill, sort of contribution between someone who is coming in at the age of 18 versus someone at the age of 21. And I think that's reflected in some of the discussions around the apprentice rate as well. And in fact, I think particularly for the apprentice rate, where in a sector like ours, engineering and manufacturing, if you're going on to an engineering apprenticeship, you're probably looking at something that's 3 or 4 years long for an 18-year-old at level 3. If you're taking on an apprentice in the first year, many of those will kind of front load some of the off-the-job training. And so there is a bit of pushback from employers when they are taking on those apprentices. They're having to pay them potentially a much higher minimum wage at a point in their sort of employment apprenticeship where actually they're probably not spending a huge amount of time kind of making a productive contribution on the shop floor. They're probably doing their off-the-job training. But by the time you get to the 3rd or 4th year of that apprenticeship, actually they're adding a significant value. And so, you know, when they're kind of ready to transition into that full-time kind of permanent skilled work at the age of maybe 21, 22, that's where they're really kind of making that productive contribution to the business. So I think that's how a lot of our member companies think about it, is more than the other changes in the sort of age threshold before. This feels like there is a bigger gap potentially in terms of skill and productivity.
Absolutely. I think that Jamie is really reflected in the answers that we're seeing coming in the Q&A box, because to everybody's points, we're seeing a lot of organisations responding today saying that their apprentices are paid either above the apprenticeship rate, above the apprentice rate, or at NMW or above NMW to attract the right candidates in the first place. But interestingly, we're also seeing a converse view where cost pressures are requiring some of our respondents to look back towards age rates in order to save cost because of the significant increases in NMW in recent years. So it's quite an interesting dichotomy of views coming out there. One point that has been raised, and I think now might be an appropriate time to ask the question to the LPC, is will there be any collaboration between yourselves with the Real Living Wage Foundation?
Caroline, thank you for that. And thanks everybody for all the comments coming through. I was just reading some of them, absolutely fascinating and very, very helpful for us as feedback as well. Just to say that we do take evidence from the Real Living Wage Foundation. That is something that we do. It forms part of our evidence base. So yes, and we will be asking them to, I'm sure, along with other stakeholders, what they believe should be meant by this cost of living recognition and genuine living wage. These are the sorts of conversations that we will have with the Real Living Wage Foundation. I don't know whether any of the other commissioners want to comment on that. Just quite straightforward. Yes, we will be taking evidence from them.
Well, look, Philippa, the only bit I would add to that is that I think, yes is absolutely the answer. But in the spirit of actually, the more views we can get in about how exactly we should be thinking about and responding to this explicit mandate about taking into account cost of living, I think that will be extremely helpful. And if indeed, as we've got in the chat, others have got thoughts on exactly how we play that, I think that will be helpful. It is obviously, in a sense, the most sort of striking new part of the mandate from the new government. And look, in my mind, how we go about disentangling, to an extent, firms already take into account the cost of living when they're thinking about their overall pay envelope. And in that sense, it's already been part of our thinking and the bloodstream for many, many years, of course, versus on the other, there is that explicit mandate to put more of a premium on it. and then the basis on which we do that and what metrics and what information we look at to inform our judgments around that will be really, really helpful. So anyone who's got helpful insights to contribute on that, including the Real Living Wage Foundation and so on, so much the better, I think.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to pose one more question to the panel before we move on to the next polling question, which is the impact of other factors in terms of restrictions on pay increases. And we've had one interesting comment from somebody in the care sector who explains that they are reliant on annual increases from the local authority and the NHS to their charge rates, which funds the increases in pay. This year, the charge rate increases were not at the level required to cover the increase in national living wage. As a result, to pay, we have reduced the differentials in branch staff and central staff, cut overhead costs, and having to swallow a reduction in profit, leading to a reduction in our ability to invest. Really concerned for the NMW increase for April 25. Can the local authorities and NHS afford the related uplift? So that's quite an interesting other pressure to be thinking about as alongside cost of living, something for the Commission to take forward. Is that something you'd like to comment on, Philippa?
And that is something I can comment on. One of the probably the two areas that that we have taken evidence from most recently, where we've seen very significant pressure. One has been the care sector, and the other has been the childcare sector. And it's been interesting that both of those sectors are in receipt of government funding streams. And I think it is something that we're going to have conversations with the government over, where at times the right hand also needs to be aware of what the left hand is doing. And there needs to be a joined up policy approach that if you're going to want your national living wage to be at 2/3 of median earnings, then that also has to be reflected in your settlement package with those particular sectors. So that I suspect will be something that Commissioners may well want to comment on when we come to writing our report later on in the year.
I think building on that, Caroline, as well, we have heard from various quarters, care and childcare sectors included, about the impact on benefit payments and what seems to be a mismatch between when people are paid by an employer and paid by the benefit system, and one can impact on the other in a negative way, which seems to restrict people's willingness to do more hours, seems to restrict their flexibility. Some of that is a bit of myth and a misunderstanding of the system, but also, as Philippa just said, it's about really having a more cohesive approach to where government funding of some form is involved, so that there's a smoothness associated with it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to move on from government funding to government enforcement now. So next polling question, please. So do you have experience with HMRC enforcement? Yes, we've had an inquiry in the last 6 years. Yes, we had an inquiry, but more than 6 years ago. No, we have never had an HMRC NMW inquiry. And I'll just remind you that answering this question is completely anonymous. So feel free to answer the question. It won't be recorded anywhere. Okay, so that's interesting. I think that this suggests that we are seeing a potential for an increase in HMRC enforcement. So only 10% had an inquiry more than 6 years ago. A quarter of our respondents have had an inquiry within the last 6 years, and 65% have never had an HMRC NMW inquiry. So would our panelists like to comment on enforcement activity?
Thank you, Caroline. I think one of the things that we have seen is an increased enforcement activity, I think, particularly around the concept of salary sacrifice. And we've taken a lot of evidence from companies who are saying that it's in the salary sacrifice space that companies have been doing a lot of work with their payroll providers to see whether or not they can ensure that they're definitely clear of any enforcement challenges. And I think that where companies do pay just above the national living wage, it's often because of a desire to make sure that they are staying really clear of any potential challenges around salary sacrifice or on enforcement issues. I'm going to pass to Patricia to comment on this one as well, as this is an area that she's given quite a lot of thought to. Patricia, were you able to comment?
Yes, I think when it comes to enforcement, if you actually look at the amount of resources that go into enforcement in the UK, it's actually a lot less than many other jurisdictions. And there have been some concerns expressed, not only by trade unions, but also employers, about what can often seem a rather patchy nature of enforcement. I think one of the things that's been a particular concern to me is the very long lags in enforcement activity. So if you look at the last round of naming and shaming of firms that were found to have not been minimum wage compliant, these were cases going back many years. And I think that's a very unsatisfactory situation to have. So I think there is a case that we possibly devote rather more resources to enforcement than we currently do, and try and ensure that what we're doing is keeping up to date with enforcement. That said, one of the things we hear quite a lot of is about the nature of the guidance provided by HMRC. This is not something the Low Pay Commission itself has much direct effect on, although we do talk to the HMRC in regular basis. But a lot of businesses have said to us that they would like to see guidance that is more specifically targeted at particular sectors rather than generic guidance. Matthew or Andrew, I don't know if you want to add anything to that from a sort of employer's perspective.
Yeah, I would. This has been absolutely enlightening to myself. I am one of the employer commissioners with a background in retail and hospitality, and there is it is a complexity of how national living wage, national minimum wage is interpreted. I mean, only the other week, they had a fascinating presentation by Deloitte with their national living wage specialists and really helping us understand the difference between how people on salaries can be interpreted, even if they're earning the same amount of money at some point and annually paid above national living wage, but at some point through the year, by virtue of how their contract is perceived from a wage enforcement perspective, could fall foul of being paid less than the national living wage. And I think it's those kind of nuances and those kind of pitfalls where employers inadvertently break the rules that we need. I think we all recognise there's a need to be clearer guidance and probably sort of an easier way of helping employers ensure that they are not making errors inadvertently and running the risk therefore being fined as a result. And this is an area that I've seen this year and had my eyes opened a lot more as a new commissioner, and it's something that I think we can help with going forwards.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to actually turn to Dale and Siobhan for a moment for their comments, because I know that a great deal of the work that you do is helping with exactly those inadvertent errors arising out of salary sacrifice or salary exchange schemes. So I just wondered whether you would like to comment on some of the experiences that you're having in practice from an advisor's side.
Yeah, and myself and Dale are having lots of conversations around this, and there's some comments reflective of that. It does feel that it can often be something that disadvantages a worker when they can get into a scheme that might provide a benefit. We know that the minimum wage legislation is complex, but we know that there are certain parts of it that are very clear, and people have found, especially with last year's change in age demographic, that they had to remove people out of the salary sacrifice scheme because of the impact to that. And similar, when we have had conversations where there are pay negotiations and the pay negotiations deferred until that payment comes out. There are certain situations where the pay increase will keep someone in a buffer, allowing the salary sacrifice to continue, but because of the pay delay, that has something that's then had a knock-on effect, and people have had to be removed from schemes as well. So it's certainly a conversation we have very, very regularly with clients.
And I think just to add to that, Siobhan, the common theme that I'm seeing when I'm working with clients is that a lot of the impact of getting things wrong with national minimum wage actually benefits the higher paid workers rather than the workers that, you know, schemes like the salary sacrifice schemes were introduced by the business to help low paid workers. Actually, it's the higher paid ones that are benefiting more because of the complexity of the national minimum wage rules. And then the second theme briefly on that is that people and employers, you know, don't want to underpay workers. They're very good employers and want to make those payments to workers, but they just find it too difficult, you know, as we've said throughout this session, too difficult to comply with some of the complexities around national minimum wage calculations and the different nuances of the legislation.
Absolutely, and what you're saying, Dale, is being picked up in the questions, that it's often the lower paid individuals who are missing out, and that businesses are struggling to try and help them.
Can I ask Caroline, Siobhan and Dale, when there's a decision to exclude the lower paid people from these benefits, the salary exchange, salary sacrifice benefits, are companies therefore reporting that the retention is under pressure or worsens, i.e. those employees decide that that's not good enough, I'll go and find a job elsewhere? Is it causing pressures in that respect?
Yeah, because I think with the increases in the conversation we've had here with the disparity in the different grade ranges, what employers are trying to do is widen that overall rewards, so that it doesn't just come down to, you know, the rate of pay. And because of that, we are seeing some people that might move to other places because the reward package overall is better. And I think it definitely does have a direct impact on the overall retention that businesses will have.
Thank you.
Jamie, would you like to add something from the manufacturing perspective?
Only just to agree with I think Patricia started with the point around just the sort of what feels like an inconsistent approach to compliance and enforcement generally, and mindful that, you know, without sort of straying too much into politics, we know that the government is going to introduce this new body, the Fair Work Agency, which will combine some of the compliance and enforcement aspects of the sort of employment landscape, which looks like it's going to include the National Minimum Wage Unit from HMRC. So just mindful that, you know, whatever happens there, what employers I think really want to see is a more kind of consistent, clear approach to enforcement across the board.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jamie. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to move to our last polling question, which is very relevant because we're going to look at how many of you actually operate salary sacrifice schemes. So the question will be up on your screen in a moment. Clearly, this is going to be an issue that you'll be thinking of in the context of NMW very carefully. So please, could you tick as many as apply? This is multiple choice. You don't have to just give one answer, but do you operate salary sacrifice schemes to offer cycle to work? That's where you can provide a bicycle for business purposes, childcare vouchers, pension scheme, car scheme, nursery schemes, so workplace childcare or other nursery schemes, other, or no, we do not offer any salary sacrifice arrangements. So that doesn't mean that they have to be offered to all of your workforce, potentially just some. if you could click all that apply, that would be very helpful. And then once we've answered this question, we will just move for a couple of slides and then spend the remaining of our time looking at some of the questions we haven't managed to answer yet. So we have nearly 70% of our respondents offer cycle to work through salary sacrifice, over half childcare vouchers, 76% pension scheme, which is not surprising because that's an extremely tax efficient benefit. 33%, a third, offer the car scheme through salary sacrifice, 8% a nursery scheme, 23% other benefits, which will probably be health insurances, gym membership, etc., and 14% no, we do not offer any salary sacrifice arrangements. So that is the vast majority of our participants who do offer salary sacrifice arrangements and therefore are potentially impacted by the issues that we've been discussing. Would anybody else like to add anything on salary sacrifice before we move on to the next slide? I think we've probably covered it in quite a lot of detail.
Just add one thing, Caroline. I think that's a really helpful kind of breakdown of the different types of salary sacrifice. We've heard quite a lot from employers that their employees would actually like the flexibility to be able to choose themselves whether or not what they wanted to do with their salary, and also that where it benefits their well-being, that's something they particularly want to be able to choose for themselves. So I think this is an interesting one and probably has some time to run on it still. I know there was a decision, a very clear decision, the government said no, nothing no form of salary sacrifice could undermine the national living wage, but employees are more and more saying that they actually want this. So it's just an interesting one.
And we're certainly seeing a lot of employers representing exactly that view, and particularly with regard to things that are no longer seen as a nice to have, such as pension savings. So particularly interesting. Thank you. Next slide, please, Natalie. So the next question is, are you budget ready? So I'm just going to give people a moment to register for a health check using the QR code below. I think it's important to note that by proactively managing your tax strategy, you can mitigate risks, optimize efficiency, focus on growth. You can register your interest for a health check to enable you to do that using that QR code on the screen. Tailored reviews can be undertaken. They will identify any potential issues before they become costly problems. I think that's something that's very important for everybody's budgeting process. So let's now move on to the last slide, and we will cover some of the Q&A that haven't been picked up during the course of our discussions. So last slide, please, Natalie. So one of the questions that I've noticed is, given the increasing rates of national minimum wage, national living wage, does the Commission believe that there's any interest to address a conflict between national minimum wage regulations and other areas of employment regs, or to simplify the NMW definition? Again, we can use salary sacrifice as an example, and I know that the difference between, say, for example, salaried workers and the new definitions can cause a lot of confusion. So I just wonder whether any simplification in those definitions is something the Commission is going to be looking at.
Thank you, Caroline. I think, Patricia, this may have been something that you've given some thought to over time. But just before I ask Patricia just to say something, it's interesting. I had a very good session with a Scottish organisation where they were saying, look, actually, there are a whole range of different things that move into the cost of employing an individual. Could we not also take into consideration some of these too? So I think there are lots of different pressures on what the definition of the national living wage would be. I think that The broad intent, though, is to ensure that the individual in receipt of pay does not fall below a certain benchmark. And that really is obviously the ultimate vision behind the national living wage. Patricia, do you want to comment?
Just to pick up on your comment, Philippa, I mean, that's right. I mean, in many ways, the national living wage is a rather crude instrument. It's setting a single floor to wage rates, hourly wage rates, across the whole economy. And we've seen in our discussion today how that impacts very differently on different sectors of the economy, not simply on what sort of markets they operate in, but also on where they get their funding from. We've heard about the problems with social care and childcare. We also hear when we go out and talk how it impacts very differently across different areas of the country. And so, you know, you could use a much more complicated system where you did have a different minimum wage rate for different sectors. You had a different minimum wage rate for different regions. That ultimately is for the government to decide. But at the moment, we have a rather simple, and it's getting simpler, national minimum living wage for those over the age of 21, possibly to become those over the age of 18, one single youth rate for 16 to 17-year-olds, and an apprentice rate. And it was the decision the last time the government looked at it that should hold. There shouldn't be allowances on things like salary sacrifice schemes. So actually, it's a rather simple system at the moment. And I think probably the issue is not will it become simpler, but will it become more complicated if we start thinking about things like a genuine living wage and what that might mean in different areas of the country and for different types of households.
Thank you, Patricia. There's a further question actually which highlights the issues that you're raising, very much goes to your point. I think the person who poses the question is actually in the hospitality sector, but I know we see it across agriculture as well as a number of other sectors. And the point raised is the individual owns a business in a remote location that employs 60 people, and they provide living accommodation for 50 of them, which includes rents, bills and food. The national minimum wage has increased, bear with me, my screen is moving, has increased 20% in the past 2 years, and the audience member has no problem with that. But the accommodation offset of £9.99 per day or £69.93 per week for full board does not cover the cost of that accommodation. The individual can do it, and has to do it because of the rural location, lack of affordable housing, no rental market and poor transport links, but is being heavily penalised because they cannot charge a competitive rent but have to pay a competitive rate of pay. I just wondered about the panel's thoughts about that. So we have a disparity between the cost of providing living accommodation and the offset that's allowed. So it's a bit of a granular question, but I wondered whether that's something that you wanted to pick up.
Patricia and Matthew, I was going to think, oh, Andrew, did you want to jump in?
No, I was just saying, I was just literally reading that question as you mentioned it, Caroline. We have spoken to agriculture sectors not long ago, actually, and this came up, as you can imagine, as one of their primary concerns. I guess, you know, looking in as an employer, which I myself and someone who's brought up in an agricultural area, one would imagine that the challenge here for employers is that the provision of accommodation offsets the cost of labour. So if accommodation wasn't provided, I suppose what I'd like to know is would the cost of labour significantly rise as people would need more in order to afford to live and work in that area? And I guess that's the bit we need to understand better, me personally anyway, in that respect, is understanding the link between the provision of accommodation, which I understand the Dan's who's submitted the question, understand that perspective. But if that wasn't there, would the cost of employing labour rise significantly more?
That's a good point. Good point. I'm going to ask a question now about timing, and I think this is relevant for an awful lot of organisations. It's very common to set pay rates for the coming year at the end of December, beginning of January, so the beginning of the calendar year. Obviously, NMW rates and LW rates increase from April. So to enable companies to budget and plan, are there plans to recommend that NMW rates are announced before the end of the year so that companies can build them into their pay negotiations?
Yeah, Caroline, everywhere we go, we hear employers say to us, the more notice that you can give us, the better. The more consistency you can give over years to us, the better. So the one message that we receive from business is longer time spans and consistency. We have our rates retreat where we take all the evidence that we have gathered during the year and consider it in October. We will then be in a position pretty much by the end of that rates retreat to make our recommendation to the government as to where we would recommend the national living wage should be set. Now, our anticipation, this is the bit we're not in control of, but our anticipation would be that they would respond to that in the forthcoming fiscal event at the end of October. Now, this last time that didn't happen. And it actually came much later for people, which I think was a challenge. But our anticipation and our recommendation would be that we have the rates retreat, we make our recommendation to government, they respond, and they give a clear indication early as to the direction of travel, and then businesses can plan.
Absolutely.
Philippa, if I would just add to that, I think, look, between now and then, my advice to anyone on the call is if you're looking to work out where you should be sort of aiming at ballpark in terms of budgeting numbers, do keep a really close eye on what's happening to median pay in the economy, and use that essentially if you're looking as any reference point, because we know our remit is to at the least hold that 2/3 median steady. And we know that our experiences over the last year or so, pay growth has been higher than expected and higher than forecast. So that keep a close watch on that before we're able to both make our recommendations and then the government is able to publicly confirm what it hasn't recommended and so on.
So very good advice. Keep your eye on Office for National Statistics median pay rates over the coming months. Jamie, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, nothing more from me, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm conscious of time. We have overrun very slightly. I'd very much like to thank Jamie Carter from Make UK and all of our panelists from the Low Pay Commission today. Philippa, is there anything that you would like to add to close?
No, just a thank you to you as well, Caroline, and to all of those who came on to listen to this panel and discussion. And thank you for all the information that you've been giving us in the sidebar as well. That's just hugely, hugely helpful for us. So thank you.
Building on that, Caroline, will we be able to get a copy of the Q&A?
We will make sure that you do, Andrew, absolutely,
Fantastic.
because I think that's hugely valuable information for everybody to share there. So yes, we'll make sure you do. Ahead of the budget, BDO will be producing further information detailing proposed changes and their impact on business. If you'd like to have any further information, please do sign up for our On Top of Tax updates via the QR code that was on the screen earlier, and also be on the slide pack that you will receive by email later on. The LPC obviously will continue to welcome any additional input that you might have, and will be producing their report ahead of the budget, the fiscal event that's coming up in October, where we'll expect the new rates to be announced, we hope, from that point of timing. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you to our attendees, and we will be in touch with slides and the recording in the near future. Thank you, everyone.